concept of this Standing for Peace and Justice rally last summer. And when we tried to throw all the obstacles to her in terms of trying to pull something like this together and the challenges, she was determined to do it. And she was determined last summer to do it on this date, on June 6th. And I've known Dorothy for a while now, and I knew when we walked away from those meetings, that we weren't trying to deter her from doing it, but we just wanted her to know kind of what she was going to be facing as she came to Washington to organize this rally. I knew I was going to be here June 6th doing this because Dorothy has a spirit that will not let anything deter her, and that's why so many of us are here today. So you've heard about the journey from pain to peace. I think that's such an important message for all of us to continue to hear about the journey, and that it is a journey, and that it is pain, and you can accept that pain, and that you will get to peace. And then you heard about the policies that are in place that are not working to help address this issue of violence in our communities. So now our panel today is going to talk about what policies, now that we know what's not working, let's try to figure out what can work, and tomorrow start talking to our legislators here in Washington about what we want to address the violence in our communities. And so we have a wonderful panel here today. First of all, starting with Seema. Seema is my counterpart at the DC ACLU affiliate and has done wonderful work over the past few years around bringing to light this issue of how an overwhelming number of black men, even in a city that is now no longer Chocolate City, but more and more a swirl of both chocolate and vanilla. Nothing wrong with that. But still how the policies, the arrest policies, the criminal justice policies in Washington, D.C. are continuing to result in over 90% of the people who are arrested for marijuana offenses in this city being black. Yes. Demographics are about 50-50 now. But all the criminal justice resources are being focused on the black communities in the District of Columbia and arresting black men for possession of small amounts of marijuana. And Seema has done an awesome job of bringing that to light and changing the law here in the District of Columbia to try to address that issue. Then this morning we also have Chantel Love, Executive Director of EMIR. I'm not sure what that stands for, Chantel. Can you tell us?
Shantae Love. Stands for Every Murder is Real.
Okay, Every Murder is Real. And then we have Dr. Betty Lee Davis, who's a grief support facilitator for Mothers in Charge. And so I'm not going to speak anymore. I want the panel to talk, and then we can take a few questions after the panel really gives us some ideas about the policies that we need to be advocating for to address this problem of homicides in our community. Seema, you want to start?
Sure, and I have about 5 minutes. Is that right?
About 7.
Okay. So I'm going to start off and give you all just a brief introduction and talk about institutional violence as I understand it, and then go right to some policy recommendations. So good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so thankful to be a part of this conversation. Actually, it was Dorothy and IBW that really raised this issue in my consciousness. And as a result of Dorothy and her outstanding work, we actually have been raising these issues locally as well. So I'm thankful to be a part of this conversation. As Jessalyn mentioned, I'm an attorney and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director here at the ACLU in the District of Columbia. And although we are here in the nation's capital, here in the district, the criminal justice system is the primary engine of injustice for people living here in the district, where you have staggering incarceration rates across the country of 1 in 3 black men serving time in jail or prison. Here in the district, that number is 3 out of every 4 black men is serving time in jail or prison. So when you think about trauma and you think about the tearing of the very fabric of the black community, and I say black community and not communities of color because I'm talking about the District of Columbia, and so I'm just calling it by exactly what it is. When you think about the tearing of the fabric of the community in that way, that black men are disappearing, which is a sort of passive way of describing it. Black men are actively being removed from communities through the criminal justice system. Starting from a very young age, you have this issue of trauma that we need to address. And today we're talking about violence and homicide, which disproportionately impacts young men of color. But I do want to say, as an initial matter, that when I talk about Black Lives Matter, I'm talking about it in the context of both black boys and black girls. And that when we fail to consider young girls, outwardly in our discourse, it sends them a message that their trauma doesn't matter. And yes, black men are disproportionately impacted by both incarceration and homicide, but the collateral consequences and other forms of institutional violence are also harming black and brown women here and across the country. So here in the district, as a part of my work, I talk to hundreds and hundreds of youth across the city. I do know your rights trainings, public forums, and that's every single year. And invariably, these conversations turn to interpersonal and institutional violence. And the thing that I have come to understand is that a coming of age for young black children in the district is this interaction with our criminal justice system. Today, the icons, the symbols of coming of age are metal detectors, hallway frisks, jump out cars have become a top level issue because jump out cars are these unmarked police cars. They call them the jump out boys. I'm sure you have an iteration in your local area. These are the policing tactics and strategies that have been exclusively used in black and brown communities to wage the war on drugs, which has essentially become nothing more than a war on black and brown communities. And so when I think about addressing homicide and addressing violence in communities, I think that we must first address the criminal justice system. Because it is that primary engine of injustice. It's not the root cause, it's not the sole source, but because it weighs so heavily on people's lives, we cannot meaningfully expect people to participate in the economy, to gain access to housing, to have meaningful employment. We can create all the opportunities they want, but they're not real for people given this burden of the criminal justice system. I recently spoke to a resident in Berry Farms. It's a local housing development that has a relatively high rate of violent crime, where the jump out tactic is used pretty aggressively among many other tactics like buy busts and informants and kicking down people's doors for drug-related warrants. Now, I'm a mother of 4 daughters, so I'm pretty sensitive to the ways of preschoolers. But this mother, what she described to me was really eye-opening. She talked about how when these unmarked cars and plainclothes officers approach this block in their neighborhood, that the preschoolers who play outside, they start yelling 12, feds, popo, and they all scatter and run. So that hit me in 2 ways. Number one, because we so delicately try to explain the issues of policing and the criminal justice system to our children. It struck me as this disenfranchisement of that parental right to really parent your children and to preserve their innocence and talk to them about these issues in a way that made them feel safe. But the other thing was that it occurred to me that if you're using plainclothes officers and unmarked cars, then what is the point? To avoid detection, right? But if a preschooler can readily identify your vehicles, then your tactic serves to do nothing more than send a message to communities that they are going to be subjected to a manner and type of policing and that is wholly unaccountable and that is outside the bounds of the protection of the law. Research indicates that black children and brown children experience a disproportionate burden of harm, whether it be institutional or interpersonal. But when they view the police department and the criminal justice system as illegitimate, they are less likely to come to those systems. So here are the policy reforms that I propose. Number one, policy reforms that address homicide should begin by requiring robust and ongoing data collection about the demographic and geographic profile of victims. Too often, black men and black and brown people, people of color are invisible in our public discourse about what victims want. Victims' voices are held up to call for more police, more incarceration, longer sentences. We need the voices of all victims to be raised up to really determine what it is that victims want, because I think those voices are diverse. We need clear definitions of who is being subjected to violence in our communities. Policy reforms that address homicide should look at the flow of dollars and whether that flow, millions in DC, billions on a national level, reflect the disproportionate burden of violence that Black and brown communities bear. So that we are addressing homicide as a health crisis, we need to approach homicide in ways that are preventative as well as in intervention, as the prior speaker mentioned. Prevention requires that we address the decaying relationship between our nation's criminal justice system and the communities that need access to trauma-informed services. We need to move the criminal justice system out of the center of our public safety paradigm, such that an effort to strengthen community-based organizations, we need to deal with mental health, drug rehabilitation, restorative justice, domestic violence counseling, mediation in ways that don't put the police and the criminal justice system at the center.
That's right.
Finally, I think that when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement, it has forced us as a nation to do something which Black communities have been declaring for a very long time, that Black Lives Matter, and to confront this disconnect between the ideals enshrined in the Bill of Rights and the way our communities and the way individuals are policed and incarcerated. When our children wander astray, whether it be in school or in their formative years, it is very rare, and I say this not just as a lawyer and a person deeply involved in criminal justice reform, but as a mother. It is very rare that a criminal justice intervention is needed or helpful. When we place our youth in juvenile facilities for misdemeanor, nonviolent offenses, when we separate them from their communities and families, when we charge them as adults, when we wrap their arms and legs in shackles, when we place them in solitary confinement, when we suspend them, when we expel them, when we exclude them, when we alienate them and isolate them, we send them a message that their lives do not matter. We know exactly what compassionate policies look like. We don't need a special school for Black and brown youth. We know what good, high-quality education looks like. You only need to go to Northwest DC to see what it looks like. Compassionate policing, public health systems that are responsive, housing, and opportunities for employment. And I look forward to answering any questions.